Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and I'm here today with Minter Dial. Is that right?
You betcha.
We're here to talk about empathy. You've just written this book, Heartificial Empathy, and we want to get to know you and talk about your book and talk about empathy in general. So I saw from your website you had a career at L'Oreal. Is that? And
Yep,
then now
cosmetics
you're,
company.
what's that?
The cosmetics company.
Cosmetics company, and that you're a thought leader, an author, and you've written like 3 or 4 books, and this is your most recent book, and you're a consultant and a professional speaker. Do you want to say more, just by way of introduction?
That really is the easy headline, if you will. The more textural headline is that I would say I'm all about change. I'm 54 years old, and I have changed countries 15 times, including spending 3.5 glorious years in Montreal, in Canada, and I've changed homes 34 times. Along the way, I've met a lot of people. I've probably visited 90 countries. I've learned a number of languages, and in that, getting to know other people and other cultures has been something that's extremely important to me, and I think links into why I wrote this book about empathy.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical Christian background, but spent 10 years traveling around the world, kind of being a seeker. And that, I think, was one of the reasons I got interested in empathy too, just seeing all the different cultures, seeing everyone's humanity. It's like, hey, people are kind of the same all around the world. So,
Well, and there are differences, and enjoying the differences and understanding that words in different languages mean different things, as gestures, even the way you look and all these things. So trying to expose yourself and be sensitive to the differences is sort of what I think underpins being good empathetic, being a proper empathic person.
what took you to travel around the world so much or move so
Well,
much?
the big old bug, but it began with my parents. My father was an expat, and we were living in Belgium and in France and England, Spain, Switzerland. That began. So of course I learned 3 languages by the age of 3, and then just kept on. And once I graduated to my own life and taking care of myself, I just continued. I love that idea, and that's just a constant curiosity and intrigue and interest. When you're changing all the time, you just never can take anything for granted.
Hmm. Well, I was just saying, I mentioned the book, like the objective of the book is to explore ways to increase empathy in business and machines. So how did that kind of come about? That it's like, what's the role of empathy in this area?
Well, I'm sure, like you, Edwin, you've observed that empathy is, let's say, under siege, or at least society is under siege, and there's an apparent lack of empathy and divides happening all over the place. And insofar as my remit and the environment I am in is business, and maybe my reputation is strongest in the business environment, it's always been my thought that you can impact change through business. If you're spending, let's say, 40 hours a week at work, that's a big chunk of change. It's certainly a lot of your disposable energy. And if you come back home and you're pissed off and unengaged and unhappy, well, it's not going to create a good environment at home. And by the way, for you. So the idea I had was that if we could try to be more empathic at work, comma, which will make your business a lot better, comma, it'll also have a flow-on effect to society.
Okay, so if you create more empathy in the work environment, it's going to improve the work environment, as well as when people go home, they're
going to learn something there. Because you go to work and you're spending all those hours at work, you might as well feel like you're learning something for the better, making your personality better, stronger. And I mean, I think the majority of the time, business people, executives tend to forsake that personal element. It's all about, profits and bottom line and performance. But if you're going to spend a concerted amount of time at work, might as well learn along the way. And really, the magic of this is that I truly do believe it's better for business. Not just, nice ambiance. It's better for decision making. It's better for customer service, making customers happy. And as soon as you make customers happy, you're obviously going to do much better in terms of profitability. So from a business standpoint, it makes consummate sense. And then the idea that is let it to seep out and move into life.
Well, and you said, I was just reading from, I made some notes about what you wrote. You said, I write this book with an eye on working on my own sensitivities and improving the way of expressing myself. So you were talking about self-awareness. So you want to say something about that? It sounds like there's a personal aspect. There's sort of, let's have this cultural shift, but there's some kind of sounds like a personal aspect to it too.
Well, so let's say from a clinical standpoint, if you want to improve your empathy, then you do need to be self-aware. I mean, that's sort of like a sine qua non for actually making progress, and to have the humility to say, well, I could be better. And so that's, I mean, from anything you want to improve on. In my particular case, I've always thought of empathy, let's say, maybe even have an empathic strain in who I am. But what happened to me was a series of events that happened in a short period of time that made me understand that I could be more empathic. And it didn't come from a place of judgment. It just opened me up to, maybe I need to work this a little bit more. So I started by writing a white paper, thinking, well, how can empathy be better? How can I be better at being empathic? And I realized that if I were to write about this, even in a business environment, what I needed to do was get to the bottom of what it is in the first place. There's no way you can just talk about empathy in business without really going through what it is and how to become more empathic, which was also the work I was doing myself. And on the first level, writing about empathy and publishing a book is tantamount to holding myself up to a higher standard. And, the inevitable thing happens, after publishing it and you do something that's a little less empathic because I'm speeding off or I misinterpret or something like this, hey, you wrote the book, you should know better. And so I was preparing myself for that kind of a confrontation, if you will. But the deeper story is that at the end of 2017, my best friend committed suicide. And I spent the entire last 6 weeks really in cahoots and talking and listening to him, and clearly wasn't successful. Not that I hold myself accountable to it, but I did realize how, wow, I could really have gotten into the fiber a little bit better. And that's sort of began me on the path. And I had a couple of other incidents in the first 6 months of 2018 that contributed also to the same awareness, or I could do better, and that's where that came from.
So with your friend, if it sounds like you felt that, if I could have been more empathic with my friend, that I might have been able to, head off that suicide. And
what I realized was that there was one part which was listening, but I also understood that listening wasn't enough. Just because you talk about it doesn't mean you won't do it. And some people say, "Oh, the goodness is he's talking about it." Well, I didn't share that with anybody at the time, but people do say, "Oh, well, at least if they're talking about it, it's a cry for help." Well, it turns out that that's not enough. And so the notion was, well, what could I have done more? Or how could I have repositioned things and tried to find a little bit of light and something that he could latch onto? Because if you're prescriptive, of course, that doesn't work either. Mm-hmm. So it was a pretty, obviously, very emotional, but very tough, because this is the biggest management issue you can call for. Personal management.
So it sounds like you were listening to him, but just the listening and being there didn't seem to be enough. And you were looking like, what else could I have done? There was something, and you knew just kind of giving him advice wouldn't work. So you're like,
Yeah.
Something else that was needed.
Yep. And, just certainly I felt that at one end, I could have maybe drawn on his other friends and tried to rally other people. But he'd always said, don't tell anybody else. I'm like, this is a pretty big thing to keep as a secret here. And yet, you try to inspire. I'm a naturally positive person, so I wanted to inject positivity into it. But anyway, no. So I again, it's sad, but I didn't think that I was responsible for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that, could have done better. And then a couple of other situations happened, and I'm like looking at myself saying, I could listen better. And, when you listen better, then you can maybe find those angles better.
Do you want to share any of those other
experiences?
Yeah,
well,
other experiences.
They're even closer to home and tougher yet. So I'll keep those ones to my side for now.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sensitive. If you don't just share what you feel comfortable with.
That's right.
Public,
Philippe is my friend. Philippe was already a tough enough experience. As one of the other moments, in June that I can talk about was a woman journalist at the Capital Gazette. Was a dear friend and it really helped me a lot in my film, which is about Annapolis, and the Capital Gazette is in Annapolis, Maryland. And Wendy Winters and I would, occasionally share kind of funny comments. And she was just a great journalist, fun, very local. And we spent a day, I remember, the entire day chatting backwards and forwards on Facebook. And then about a week later, she was murdered in her office for being a journalist. And I just thought, gosh, how do I even talk to the family and other members? Those are those difficult situations where it's, you just don't know what to say. And, so that's another example of trying to figure out how I could be more empathic.
Yeah. So when there's like real tragedy, how do you respond to people and be empathic? Yeah.
Because I'm naturally more positive. So if someone's positive and someone's, celebrating something beautiful, it's the easiest thing in the world to sort of hug them and high five them and, yay, good for you, man.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's dark and difficult, it's not my usual ballywick. So that's why it was more complicated for me.
Oh, this was what was the paper? This is the newspaper where the journalists were shot?
Yeah, there were 5 journalists killed.
Oh my goodness. Because it was, I feel a little sad here because my partner's cousin was one of the people shot there, Gerald Fishman. And I had just spent just a couple of weeks before, I had been sitting at my partner Joan, her mother was passing. She had a cerebral hemorrhage. And so Gerald and I were sitting at her deathbed, talking, and then just a couple of weeks later, he was, shot there. So, it was like, whew, wow, that was pretty tough. Mm-hmm. But that's where, empathy, is about these tough situations in life and how do we navigate them. And
that's it. And, going back into a more positive space is also about building bridges where it might even be still tough. Building bridges with people who have differing perspectives, different, points of view that might be anathema to you. And that's tough as well. The other one's more tragic tough. The other one, and this one, what I'm just talking about now, is more, real life situations, and people are on the other side, and we need to find ways to tap in and connect and not just say, you are the enemy, because we belong in the same country. We're actually the same species.
Do you mean like more conflict, so interpersonal conflict kind of situations?
Well, value stories. We have different reasons for voting different parties and thinking different things. And when you're at a dinner table and someone from the other side of the table speaks about a political point of view that's completely not yours, the natural limbic system sort of gets into a pretty aggressive mode, and that can quickly then go ballistic, and then the dinner party is, ruined. Well, whoop-de-doo for the dinner party. But in general, these are the opportunities to really exercise that empathic mode. It's not about accepting everything, right? But just trying to find ways to understand why they're thinking that way, and then maybe even find terrain on which we can agree, and then there's a chance that we might end up having a reasonable conversation.
Okay, so you're looking like at a dinner where it was like people are in conflict, political conflict, and how do you sort of navigate that empathically? And
exactly.
did you come up with a solution? Like, how would you address that? What's from your learnings? How would you address that now?
Yeah. So in the realm of, I'm going to face it, because you can also just sort of tuck it under the carpet and not mention sex and politics and religion or whatever. So in the mode of, I want to face it, well, one of the things that I'm trying to do is find ways to agree, or terrain of entente. And the simplistic mode, you and I might say, well, hey, you and I were both wearing T-shirts. We both decided to do that. So that's a common goal. We got up and we decided to wear a T-shirt as opposed to, whatever, turtleneck or whatever. You and I are men, white men. We have that in common. We're wearing earphones that are tucked into our ears. So, I'm making anecdotal ideas, but the idea is to try to find things where the guy or the person, in front of you can't say no. We're in, like in a sales mode, get yeses.
Mm-hmm.
And so, hey, I noticed you're wearing a great T-shirt. It's written empathy on it. And that's really neat. So you throw a compliment. And I think that in the realm of being empathic, showing a vulnerability or the graciousness of a compliment is one way of establishing a rapport.
Mm-hmm. So there's this table. You're in it. Somebody's on the other side politically, and you can feel the tensions. You don't agree with what they're saying, and you've got your point of view, and you can feel the tension kind of rising.
Right.
And so you can kind of like back off, say, "Oh, we're just going to kind of avoid this because you don't like where this is going." So that's sort of the avoidance approach, but you want to be able to sort of have an engagement where you're not
and establish a rapport, because if it's just a face-off of black versus white, then it's unlikely you're going to have anything to come back on. You need to establish areas of zones of entente. My new book I'm writing is talking about how to build great brands, and one of the challenges is, how do you make an environment where conflict and at least constructive debate is propitious and well executed? Because let's say you and I disagree. We're gonna launch this product, and you say it should be worth 10, and I say it should be worth 5. We should sell at that price. Well, you and I are going to fight. But as long as we're fighting because we know that there's a connecting tissue as to what we're trying to do, we agreed on that in advance, then we will come back to that. Well, listen, Edwin, you and I agreed that this is our common goal here. How does 5 or 10 work better for that? And then we can circle back and so, but in this idea of the dinner party where you're having this conflict, if you can have some zones of entente, listen, Ed, you and I, we're both wearing T-shirts. Not that's a very superficial, of course, concept, but something that if you want to get into the depth of the conversation, let's say we bring the political content out. The content might be that you believe in not having guns, and I believe in carrying guns, let's say, as to take one of the more topical hard conversations. Well, in which case maybe I could say something like, well, I understand that, and I agree with you that if we didn't have any guns, anybody had any guns, then there wouldn't be quite as many deaths. let's say I agree with you on that, and that's something that you hold firm, then I'm actually showing that I agree with that, and yet I have my position.
So you're trying to find a point of agreement so that there is an agreement, and from that agreement you can sort of try to build a constructive relationship, I guess, exactly. A positive relationship, but you got to have some place to build off of so you can keep expanding the zone of agreement in a sense.
Well, and what I'm talking about is if I'm executing this sort of empathic plan by myself, because the better argument or the better way to do this would be to say, Edwin, you and I, we have a conflicting side of arguments on this one topic. We're going to play a game, and you can invite the person and say, hey, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about 3 things that I agree with your perspective. What I'm going to ask you to do in return is to agree with 3 things that I've said in my perspective. And so then if you can sort of explicit that mode in a conflictual environment at a dinner party, it can do a lot to diffuse and create a rapport. And then at the end of the day, well, you're not so bad. And basically we have 6 things in common. But yet we have this other opinion. So it's just come out of that. That's we can agree to disagree. But maybe in the 3 and 3 that we've shown, I might agree in 2 and you might agree in 1 really down deep, and convert to that idea somehow.
Well, the approach that I've been kind of working on, for these type of situations is what I call the empathy circle. So it's this, in terms of, how to practice empathy, how to deepen practice of it. If you look at the literature and so forth, it's usually like, well, learn empathic listening, reflective listening, which is sort of the work that Carl Rogers did, in the therapeutic world, where someone was in distress, sort of like your friend in distress. They go to a therapist, and the therapist just listens to the person and just kind of accompanies them on their journey, in terms of which is one definition of, or how Carl Rogers defined empathy, like, oh, you've got this journey, I'm just going to accompany you on it in your leading wherever you want to go, and just accompanying the person is sort of a healing experience in and of itself. And but his was sort of a therapist-client relationship, sort of a professionalized relationship. So it's not really equal. So the person doing the speaking is also not doing the listening, right? It's not a mutually. They're not both. No. It's sort of an unequal relationship.
Well, plus, oftentimes one is paying for it. In terms of
paying with it. It's like, I don't want to pay to listen to you, right? But maybe there should be. I think,
right.
I think the whole therapy stuff needs to be redesigned to more equals, that you're actually learning how to listen, and so the empathy circle, what I'm just calling an empathy circle, is mutual listening. I listen to you, for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, do reflective listening. So I confirm that I'm hearing you. And then we shift, and it's my turn to speak. And then you listen and confirm. So sort of this back and forth, but that does take a sort of an agreement. So in a dinner environment, if you can have an agreement to use that process, then it slows the conversation down. And, people don't get upset, or they get upset, but their anger or whatever is heard, and then you kind of go back and forth. And I've done this exact mediation, like we have this empathy tent that we take out to political places, like in Berkeley, and I did that exact thing with a conservative woman and it was a conservative woman and a conservative liberal female in Berkeley. And we're just out in the tent. We had an empathy circle like this, and for half an hour they talked about gun violence, and at the end they gave each other hugs. Because so anyway, that's sort of the process that I've been really trying to develop more, popularize. And if people knew this process and could agree to it, I mean, that's the problem. There's an initial agreement that this is how we're going to have the dialogue. And getting that agreement is a little bit of a challenge out in the wild, so to speak.
I totally agree. And so on the one hand, you can create this situation. What I was trying to refer to back was sort of how to operate in standard affairs.
Yeah.
And in the end of the day, what I feel you're talking about with the circle of empathy is civil conversation, where you don't interrupt each other, where you listen, not with your necessary filter. And the next thing I'm going to say to rebut what I have to say anyway, even if you don't say anything has any link with it, I'm going to just throw it in because that's what I want to say anyway, kind of thinking. And so when I'm a big fan of individuals like Sam Harris, who are trying to show how to have constructive conversations, civil conversations on topics that are difficult to have. And I think that those long-form conversations with individuals with differing opinions, where he obviously sets the stage, the rules, and demonstrates the behavior that he wants to see happen, then you can really, I think, have a lot more interesting conversations. And these podcasts that this group, whether it's Rogan or others, are having are showing how we can have differences of opinion, and yet at the end of the day, hug.
Yeah, I saw a podcast. Well, it was with Jordan Peterson. So he was actually in a conversation with Sam Harris, and they were doing some kind of public event, and he said, well, there's this. He started off by saying, there's this way of talking where you reflect back your understanding of what the other person has said.
Right.
And it's really tough. It's really hard. We're going to try to do it here. And then he did empathic listening, a reflection of Sam Harris. And then he had Sam Harris do a reflection of what he had to say, because they had some kind of a real conflict, and it really had degenerated, and they were trying to clean it up in subsequent dialogues. And so they started off, and they both got ovations for their
reflective listening.
Their reflective listening. But what I think would be interesting, like you're mentioning Joe Rogan and so forth, is getting really polarized people. Because it's really hard to get the far left into these dialogues, without it kind of blowing up. Is to have these empathic listening dialogues between opposing sides. So I've been trying to set that up. We've been doing it with conservatives and the left and the right, kind of more at a grassroots level. But I think I'd like to kind of scale it up to have more influential people having these kind of dialogues.
Well, I mean, my opinion is that Harris and Peterson are doing a good job in that, and maybe there'll be ways to bring those kinds of people. I think they do a good job on that. They actually have it somehow within them to be more empathic, at least in their conversations. They also, in that context, have a common goal, which is to rise up the media and gain bigger popularity. So that common, I don't know if that's exactly their goal, but I think they also have subscribed to something higher together.
Mm-hmm. So they have a bigger vision of seeking the truth or something like that.
And that they can then come back to that. Hey, listen, I was pissed off at you, Harris, about this, but this is this is why we're going to do it again, because we're trying to get here to this higher pitch.
They can disagree, and then they keep coming back to trying to resolve the issues, because they've got that quest for truth, maybe, that they're...
And there's an intellectual challenge that they constantly put themselves to, and they're trying to find different ways of arguing their idea, and I respect them entirely intellectually for what they're trying to do, and I think I'm pretty impressed also by their marketing. Yeah. I've attended even one of their events with Peterson and Harrison.
Well, Joe Rogan, I think that's part of his real appeal. I mean, it seems to me he's deeply empathic in his listening. His huge, deep empathic presence. You can really just hear people and create a sort of an empathic field where they can sort of express themselves.
Well, another thing that I so in the elements that are really useful in creating empathy, and something I talk a lot about with regard to AI, is transparency. And what Rogan does that I think is particularly interesting is he's called to task immediately in front of everybody by his team that's on the side, so that they're busy beavers. If he says something wrong, or he's asked them to task them to find something out, there's immediately going to be brought to it. And I find that some sort of element of truthfulness, and this transparency somehow participates in that. I think it can go a lot further, because in the media there's so much fake news and so on. But
so you feel that his support team kind of calls him on stuff that may not be accurate, or kind of keeps him,
at least it keeps him real, that they're fact checking as he's speaking. So that element of real time fact checking is kind of cool, as opposed to saying, doing a little blurb in the newspaper the following day. Well, what we said yesterday, we were wrong on. You never read that.
Yeah. Well, I did want to talk about the definition of empathy, like what you're calling empathy. I mean, there's so much I know we can talk for hours, and sure. I can sense that already. But it's like the whole, I mean, if you look at the literature, the academics, they all start with, hey, there's a lot of definitions of empathy. It's a real mess out there about what we're even talking about. And then, and people like, Dan Batson, says, there's all these definitions. You can't say they're right or wrong per se, but when you start your conversation, it's good to just define your terms. Like, what are we, kind of talking about in terms of empathy? So I did see that, you'd started your definition around terms of cognitive and emotional empathy. So I thought maybe we could use, the example you gave of, why you got interested in empathy with your friend who was committed suicide, and he's speaking, and you're there listening, and what was the empathy? What was your empathy? How does emotional empathy and cognitive empathy map onto that dialogue, or that relationship that you had with him?
So in that particular situation, the overriding feeling was actually responsibility. And I knew I was one of the only privileged people to be aware of what he was thinking. So I felt that was a responsibility. And so I was constantly also in the mode of, oh, what do I need to do? So as much as empathy is not about doing, I always had the what am I supposed to do situation going on. And I didn't feel that listening was a satisfactory action. Anyway, so that's perhaps a good way of starting off, because empathy, in the end of the day, isn't about doing. It's about receiving. And in that, you receive either on an emotional level or a cognitive level. And so in his situation, obviously I know him. I knew him for 20 years, and we had a long friendship, and I knew many things about him. He was never very emotional. He was someone who's very guarded in his feelings. And in any event, nor am I particularly emotional in the way I can be emotional on stage and I can express. But I was never one to particularly get into what the other person's feeling in myself. So the affective empathy. I was much more interested in understanding why he's feeling what he's feeling. Because in that is I thought that's where I would find the solution to what I needed to do to act. And it wasn't necessarily about compassion. It really was to try to figure out how to bring light to his vision. So which is, I'm not sure, I don't think I would characterize that as compassion. I was really trying to figure out a solution. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of the mode that that's typically me. I'm very sort of solution oriented, want to fix this. And perhaps if I had been listening more, perhaps I would find a better clue instead of jumping to life will be better. which seems so trite at some level. But anyway, so if I go back to my definition of empathy, it's really about a receptive mode and how you understand what's happening in the other person. It's about extracting yourself, or at least in the cognitive side anyway, extracting yourself from the vision and really trying to be in the shoes of the other person, in the mind and the context and the feelings of the other person eventually, to really understand what they're feeling and why they're feeling what they feel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what I'm hearing there is your friend was sharing with you and you would listen, but you were kind of in your thinking about, oh, how can I fix this? Trying to sort of maybe analyze it, looking for solutions. And you're seeing now that if you had been maybe more present and just been with him more instead of being in that fix-it mode, that may have been more supportive. And that empathy would be to have had that deeper presence with him. Yeah, in the literature, if you look at that, fixing is often seen as sort of a block to empathy, that, oh, I'm going to fix this person. And it's kind of like about, being in your own head instead of being present. So that's, in terms of the definition of empathy, I also see that as, so the core part of empathy is being with the other person, as you're saying. So I think we have sort of agreement is like, it's like a deep presence with that person, kind of who is on their journey, and kind of accompanying them on their journey.
And the underneath need was to jump in, because at some level you could just sort of passively sit there and listen and listen and then listen. And I had no confidence that was satisfactory.
Mm-hmm. Do you still feel that? Do you still feel that that the listening wasn't enough, that something needed to happen? Is that?
Well, I think that there's another part to the equation, which is questioning.
Mm-hmm.
Intelligent questions. Because those inserting intelligent questions that make, well, I hadn't thought about that. Or let me then, wind on about that, the other person, then you listen to that answer. But so I'm not sure I can accurately define where that stops being empathic, because a question is an action. And I could just say, oh, well, tell me more about that. Mm-hmm. Or I could say, well, how about if you thought about it differently? And is that the stopping of empathy, and that sort of being more therapeutic, and not in being a little more imposing about what I'm trying to get at, even if I don't tell him what he should be thinking about. That line of questioning is more precise, if you will, and more directive, and I'm trying to get somewhere. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I just say, well, tell me more about that. We've got another hour. Tell me more about that. My instincts don't allow me just to sit there and listen. I don't know how to do that. I'm not a therapist. Mm-hmm. I'm a normal person, that tries to get on life. And I feel like I had that responsibility to inject some of my enthusiasm, some of my viewpoints, to show that his viewpoint was not all right.
Mm-hmm. So you're feeling like a sense of responsibility to contribute something, like, you have a lot of positivity, you want to convey that positivity to him, and also maybe, ask some questions to kind of bring him out. And so there's
asking questions that sort of, just allow him to speak, and because if you stop speaking, well, tell me some more about this and that. You can be very sort of neutral in the questions, or you can be a little bit more incisive.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're sort of exploring the nature of question asking. There's, at what point is it being very directive, and at what point is it just sort of kind of helping the person move along in their journey? So
it's very nuanced what I'm saying, because I can say, well, don't you think it would be better if day followed night, right? And the guy says, well, yeah, that's what happens. Okay, well, then that's the thing for you. That's sort of a question, but it gets too directive and prescriptive. And so you have to find a nuanced way to allow for them to come up with the aha, but without saying it. There's nothing like, selling you something that you think is your idea. I mean, that's the ultimate of a great salesperson, great listening. And then you come up with the idea, then that's what you should do. But that's what I wanted you to do the whole time. Buy my, sell my product at £5 or whatever I said before.
That's interesting, because it's that quality. It's something I've noticed is I can, suggest something to someone, but I can just listen to them, and it's almost the direction is a feeling. And it's a feeling between us, and there comes a point where the other person actually says the feeling. It's like they have said the feeling. I didn't say the feeling, but they have said the feeling. And it's an interesting that it's like the direction is in the air around us, and they are naming that feeling without. If I were to say it, it would kind of create something disjointive. It'd be sort of disjointive in the relationship. But when they say it, it maintains sort of the connection.
Well, I mean, it does sound like ESP, right? And presumably there's chemistries that happen between two people, and I don't think that maybe even if you said it, you might not express it the same way as they did. And, and I guess it also depends on the relationship we have, because you can both be talking about a mutual interest, or you can have someone in need of help and someone providing help or doing the listening, right? Because how often do you have equal status on this? And my issue is bigger than yours, kind of thing. And so you're not in a mutual situation. There's one who's doing more listening because I got this shit. Let me tell you, I want to dump it on you.
Mm-hmm.
And if I dump it on you, and then you immediately say, well, that reminds me of the time that I had, and then dump on me, and all of a sudden, instead of my talking about my situation, you're now talking about your situation, and I got left in the dust. And so that's that notion of how we fitting and what position we have. But we can have changes in the conversation, but it's sort of, you do need to listen out to the person you're trying to listen to before you interject. Well, I know what you're feeling like. It reminds me of the time that and all of a sudden it's about me.
Yeah. So it's with empathy, it's like who is being listened to, who is being heard. You're kind of listening to the person, and then you're kind of having that presence, and then it triggers something in the listener's mind, a story, and then the attention shifts back to them.
Right.
And so, like how does the relation, and then there's sort of that aspect of, in terms of definitions of empathy is, you mentioned cognitive empathy and emotional empathy, which we can still explore more. But there's something I would call relational empathy, is what is the level of empathy in the relationship? Because a lot of times it seems to me that the empathy gets defined in an individualistic terms.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you as an individual are listening to others, but it's really, you and I, for example, are in a relationship. We're kind of going back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we actually increase the depth of empathy in our relationship, which is sort of a perspective outside of me or you. It's actually sort of on us.
Well, in my study, I got the idea of that there's a notion of self-empathy. So at the really individual level. And then you have this notion, I would call it relational empathy, which is cognitive and emotional or affective. And then what I had was, and I think it's interesting, your idea of this, that sort of overviewing relational empathy. But what I went to was more organizational empathy. And so that speaks to a more of a collective empathy, which you might use as relational, but I'm thinking of it within the context of a larger group of people, and they can be united because they're employees of a company. But it can also relate to the empathy that they show towards stakeholders, externals, including customers. And so that's sort of how I planted my decor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I think that relational empathy in that respect would probably be fit on, one-to-one, but also within a larger group.
Mm-hmm.
How empathic is that environment where you've got 10 people in an open space in an office, and that's maybe relational in your words and organizational in mine.
I see. Well, it's very similar to what I'm looking at, so the model, the experience is there is that self-empathy, being aware of, what's going on in myself, and sort of feeling into my own visceral, sensing into the other. So that's the self-empathy, sensing into your experience. And I'm seeing the nodding of your head. So the agreement, the smile that comes, I'm feeling into where you are. Then there's the the relational, and then maybe the cultural. I'm seeing as a culture of empathy, which is kind of like your organizational, because there's a organizational culture, and how might we increase the level of empathy in that culture, the organizational culture, and the country, the society, and there's that culture. So that's how. One of the ways that I model it. The other part is in terms of the emotional cognitive empathy. I have kind of trouble with those terms. If they seem very academic in terms of, it's the academics who have come up with these very academic kind of terms, and so. For me, the empathy, just listening to you, for example, is, feeling into being sensitive to your experience. I would see as empathy, and what maybe the cognitive empathy that you're talking about, where you're talking about it being perspective taking, right? And you referenced Krishnarik, Roman. You mentioned Krishnarik, so that we take the perspective of someone sort of like an actor, right? That I can say, I am Minter Dahl, and what am I feeling? What is my feeling like an actor would? And so I would say that's sort of, I actually call that imaginative empathy, which I think is a nicer term than cognitive, because you can take on the role of someone else and act from that role. And I see this in mediation all the time. You're doing mediation work. You can take on the role of someone in a mediation circle, and it's almost like the person becomes the person that they're taking on the role. It's if they're a strict father, right? They take that on, and from their own internal feelings, what comes up, they share that. And so that's, so I'm calling that imaginative empathy.
Right. Well, first of all, I loved acting, and I found that was wonderful, and being a thespian at heart. I'm a creative at heart. But the purpose of my book was to aim for business leaders. So the person reading my book, they're not academics, but they are people who are going to cotton on to topics and terminology in different ways. And so I was very much trying to make sure that I spoke to them in ways that they would appreciate. Generally speaking, I was thinking about less empathic people. So to try to get into their minds and to figure out how I could sway them to believe that empathy could be a really good way. So, in writing it, I had to try to figure out how to be empathic in the writing. And that included the vocabulary that I was going to use, is the examples that I used. And rather than go into the pathos of the reason why I started writing the book, for example, which I thought would be useful, but very much catering to an empathic mind, as opposed to the hard-nosed Wall Street financier. And while that may have also gotten into them, and I could have tapped into an emotional space, I preferred to write in a more business-like manner, because that's an easier route for them to understand. That was my approach. And so the idea then following that is to say that in a business environment, the bigger opportunity is to explore the cognitive empathy, where you're not necessarily talking about the actions that are following, but you're in a mode of listening more and taking the time to listen, And if you do that, the chances are you're going to better understand your employees' gestalt and their state of mind, and find ways to engage them better, motivate them more. Because if you go too far, the distinct impression can be one of manipulation. And because, you know, if you get excellent at it all the time, well, you could end up, you know, like a sociopath, getting always what I want because I listen so well. I know how to manipulate and I know what you're thinking about. And I mean, and that's part of this picture too. It's, I didn't want to have the tyranny of empathy, I call it, where we're trying to be empathic all the time, because that's sort of like trying to be perfect all the time. Being perfect all the time is no good. We are not meant that way. I think that the human condition is to have naughtiness and to have times where we're not perfect. And so to hold myself up to be 100% saintly, if I were to say that empathy is a saintly activity, it's not going to fly. At some level, I will crack. And I think then, and you know, I see it so often around us. We're holding ourselves up to standards that aren't tenable. And I think that we also need to be talking about that. So
let me kind of reflect here what I'm hearing. So you were wanting to speak to business owners because you see that if business could be more empathic, that could have a societal impact, you know, positive societal impact. And so you're really trying to find the language that would speak to business or the people in business and kind of use their vocabulary. And you also are kind of making the point that you can't say, well, you have to be empathic all the time because there's sort of a tyranny of being empathic, you know,
yeah.
of saying that, and you got to have space for.
Well, and pragmatically speaking, there are times when you just got to decide. You know, and you know, the let's say that 12 o'clock is the deadline for the print to go to bed. Noon isn't going to hold on for another half an hour of conversation. It might be the nice thing to do. It might even be the right thing to do for a better product, but noon is the deadline. And so time is what it is. And so in the constraints that one has, because we only have a certain amount of time, and the opportunity for another 2.5 hour conversation, nice to have, but we can't have it. And so sometimes you need to call it where it is and do what you have to do. And it may not be the perfect solution. Not everybody's going to be happy, but sometimes you just have to do that. So, you know, I move on the term, the benevolent dictator. If we're always trying to be consensual, that will pull down the final product.
Yeah, I see that too. What I'm hearing is that there's empathy, which is sort of this integrative process, you know, listening and dialogue, coming to sort of a consensus for mutual understanding. But we live in a world that has these time constraints, and something's got to happen, and that's like maybe why the military is so authoritarian. Is like decisions have to be made, quick decisions. They might be wrong decisions, but something's got to be decided here. So we go into a very highly authoritarian, you know, process because there's not time to, you know, have a 3 or 4 hour discussion about whether we attack this hill or not, you know.
Exactly.
So
and I want to add in,
it's the reality of life that there is this. I mean, it's a good in terms of a block to empathy. Time constraints is the reality of you know, sort of a block to this empathic integration.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got time pressure and you have pressure in general, stress in general, are the killers of empathy. I wanted to pick up on the military reference you made, because I, like you, I would say that the military is not an environment where empathy has prime positioning. Yet I understood, and I interviewed a chap called Michael Ventura, who wrote a book called Applied Empathy. And he actually works with West Point, which is the training ground for officers of the Army, and focusing on cognitive empathy. They're actually training the officers to be on empathy because warfare has changed. Whereas previously you used to sort of send, let's say, men over the hill and get slaughtered. Now the type of work that the military has to do is in small platoons walking in environments where they speak a different language, in a different culture, a different environment, and you need to know whether the person behind that veil is friend or foe. And the opportunity to use empathy in that environment is very different, as well as the impact and benefit of having empathy with your team. So before going into that moment when you are going to walk as 6 soldiers through a hostile territory, hey, how do you feel? And if you can ask them, I'm feeling nervous, at least you have an opportunity to gauge that, because if they're nervous, they might be hair trigger, and that's not going to be good for the result in that village where you're walking through.
Yeah, so I've interviewed, talked with Michael too. So
Yeah.
Okay, so there's this moment of decision making, right? That, okay, we got to shut down the empathy. Whoever's in charge makes the decision because of the context. And then you're sort of saying that it's before that decision happens, there's a whole history that happened before that, right? And you can have a lot of empathic process, attitude developed in the culture already. So, and we do that with our empathy tent, for example. We go out into, like, where the political left are having, knockdown, drag out street fights, and we set up there and try to listen to both sides. But before we start, we all get in a circle and we say, well, how are you feeling now about, being here? And it's like, hey, I'm feeling pretty stressed. I'm feeling pretty anxious. But just that sense of sharing and hearing where everyone is creates a sense of grounding. And then it gives more resilience, empathic resilience for those stressful situations. Yeah. And then afterwards, we do an empathic debrief. And then you kind of work through, and here. So there's a lot of empathy before, during and after, but, in those moments, maybe decisions have to be made. So it's not all about that moment of decision. There's a whole upstream space for fostering a more empathic culture. And I think that's what you're sort of saying.
That's right. I'm going to bring up a new thought, which is the notion of a bank of empathy. And you create credits, by being like that originally, most of the time previously, so that when I do have, I lose my lid because, God damn it, this is what I want. Okay, well, he's under pressure. Normally he's not like that. And then you can excuse yourself afterwards. But you know what I mean? There's like, if you have a general level of empathy, and sometimes you just stressed out, you end up saying, I got to make the decision. I think people could be more understanding of that.
Yeah.
In a context where it's never always perfect, because that is life. And as much as you and I are undergoing an empathic conversation today, there are times when something is going to piss off Edwin. Someone runs in front of you, walks with their telephone and bumps into you. And you're wearing coffee and the coffee spills on you. If you don't get pissed, you put your little empathic mode down. Couldn't you just look up, while you're walking? I don't have time at that moment. I certainly don't have the mindset to go and say, you know what's going to mean for me? Or I don't know what you would do to sort of undo that situation where you have a coffee stain all over your hot coffee, all over your chest because the guy didn't look up from their bloody phone as they're walking into you.
Yeah. So it's sort of a bank of empathy, like in a business or something where there's been a lot of empathy beforehand, and you have developed sort of a trust. There's a trust. Oh, we will be heard, we won't be ignored. And then when that moment of lack of empathy comes, you've got, well, I know we can talk about this afterwards. That there's going to be a space for us to dialogue and be heard about it and resolve it. So it takes off the edge of that moment of, blow up or whatever.
No, as I interviewed Chris Voss, and he just put up on my podcast. Chris is a kidnap negotiator. He led the FBI in international kidnapping negotiations, and he talks about empathy. And one of the things he said, which I really appreciate, he says that at no time is anger a good thing. So with that being said, I can say I'd like to not be angry. And I think meditation, by the way, is a singularly wonderful thing to practice, and should be sort of, I think, inculcated into high schools everywhere, and everyone should learn the benefits of meditation, and also maybe understand that anger is not a good thing to have.
Well,
but I mean, if we're never angry about anything, then are we human? I think there's a notion of needing to have that sort of visceral passion that's part of us as well. So I don't believe I can go through life without ever being angry.
Well, with the empathy circle that I was talking about, that's sort of the main sort of practice I've been trying to develop and expand. And just yesterday, we had an empathy circle with my family. So my brother, my sister, and their spouses. So the 5 of us were in empathy circle. The issue is that my sister-in-law has determined that my brother is on the spectrum, and it's affecting their relationship. So she wanted like a family empathy circle to talk about it. And, I've kind of introduced this empathic listening process. But there was we haven't had an empathy circle for a long time. So some real tensions had built between my sister-in-law and sister. So my sister just vented this anger, it was just like, and it was like my sister-in-law is saying, oh, this is your real feelings,
Right, exactly.
But we had the empathy circle process is one person speaks and they select who they're going to speak to. They speak whatever they want to say, just be whatever they want to say. The listener reflects back their understanding of what the speaker has said to the satisfaction of the speaker. That I feel fully, until they feel fully
understood.
We understood to their satisfaction. And we sometimes put a time limit, 5-10 minutes for that time limit issue that you're talking about, because that is one of the big issues. Somebody can go on forever and ever. And then once the speaker feels heard, then it's the listener's turn to become the speaker, and it's their choice who to speak to. And then they speak to that person, and that person reflects back until they feel that speaker feels heard to their satisfaction. It just goes around like that. We went for 4 hours, So
was that 4 hours set ahead of time?
We did create. I know these things take a long time, and we did create that space. I thought 3 hours, but it just went into 4. And
yeah, I mean, because that notion of time is real, and people have kids to pick up and stuff that happens, and you just can't make abstraction of that.
Yeah.
And yet, if you put it like a time cooker on it, then it becomes harder. All of a sudden, as you get towards the end, the time hammer comes in, and that stress factor removes our ability, and we're not listening well. We're thinking about time, as I am, by the way, Edwin, because I have.
That's right. I could talk for we should do a
well,
long.
Evidently,
Joe Rogan does 3 hours.
I know.
Maybe we can do this again
that'd be lovely.
We'll put the time out for 3 hours.
That's it. I'm good on that. Hey, Edwin.
Okay, good. We'll do it, because I really enjoyed this conversation, and really the intimacy and the depth of it. It's very meaningful.
My pleasure, Edwin. Thank you for having on.
Book and your website too, which is minterdial.com. So yep. minterdial.com, and we will to be continued. So thanks.
Beautiful. Thank you, Edwin. Appreciate it.